Terry Nelson is a retired Manchester Schools assistant principal. While his entire career has been in the education field, he has always harbored a love of history. Before marrying his wife, Barbara, Terry spent several summers working as a volunteer on archaeological digs in northern England. Later on, Terry and Barbara would take their two sons on family vacations, visiting important sites in American history, from Vicksburg to Gettysburg and Fort Mackinaw to the Harry Truman Little White House on Key West. As a result, their sons are now taking their own children to visit historic places. After moving from Michigan to Dover, New Hampshire, Terry worked for 2 years as a special education consultant for the New Hampshire Department of Education. This position afforded him the opportunity to visit and serve 16 southern New Hampshire school districts. And along the way, he ran across many out-of-the-way, little-known historic sites. In his book, Hidden History of the New Hampshire Seacoast, Terry explores and illuminates these little-known places and the stories behind them. And if you are interested, there are copies of Terry's book for sale over there. And we also have a couple copies in our library collection if you want to check one out. So with that, Terry, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everybody, again. Let me get this thing off here and hopefully it won't blow up the world. I'm gonna hit continue on this and see what happens.
Okay.
And it's okay. So, as Katie mentioned, originally from Michigan and did a lot of wandering around the state when I was a special ed consultant, and then driving back and forth from Manchester. I would often take alternate routes to Dover. There's quite a few you can take, and so I'd run across things, and I finally decided to put a book together about all these things and the stories that are behind them that I had found. And Katie, we're not changing the picture again. So we might have to just talk about this picture. Let's try it this way. No. So I need to.
Can't find your
Cursor.
mouse.
It's not here. There we go. How'd you do it?
I just clicked on the.
Clicked on that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's hope it works. So this is an 80-foot tire outside of Allen Park, Michigan. It's on I-94, just west of Detroit. So if you're going to the airport, if you're going to Ann Arbor or Kalamazoo or Chicago, you drive by that both ways. I've been by it hundreds of times. And finally, I wondered, well, what the heck is this thing? Why is there an 80-foot tire other than the fact that the tire company was there by the freeway? What was the story behind the tire? I wanted to find out, and turns out this is the story behind the tire. It was a Ferris wheel at the New York World's Fair in 1964. And so I thought that was kind of a fascinating insight. I had no idea what that, growing up as a kid, we all knew the tire, but I never knew what it was. I was really surprised to find out that, and that's sort of what informed me wanting to write this book, is what are the stories behind some of the things I ran across as I was wandering around, going back and forth to work here in New Hampshire. The first one really that got the book started, and the whole idea, is this little monument here on Route 56, just past Nottingham Square. Has anybody been to Nottingham Square? Do you know that area? It's a beautiful spot. It's about 5 miles up the road from Pawtuckaway Park. And so I drove by that a bunch of times and wondered what it was. And finally, I decided to get out and look and see what it was all about. Turns out it's about this guy, Henry Dearborn, who was a general, many other things as well. I had not heard of him, but obviously I found out he's got a fascinating past. I'll mention later that during the Revolutionary War, during which he served, if you're interested in the Revolutionary War, he has by far the most extensive journals you could get. He has virtually every day from 1775 to 1783 in a journal. And this is one of my favorite journal entries. I eat part of a fried rattlesnake today, which would have tasted very well had it not been snake. And that's sort of the anecdotes are amazing. This is July 7th, 1779. On July 5th, 1779, he was with his fellow officers, some tavern somewhere, celebrating what was then the 3rd anniversary of American independence. They were drinking toasts, they were drinking wine, and they were having a great time. And 2 days later, he's out foraging for rattlesnakes to eat. And that was sort of the life of a Revolutionary War soldier and sort of some of the things that he went through. Oh, there we go. What's on that little monument? It says, kind of blocked at the top, General Henry Dearborn, 1751 to 1829, marched with 60 Minutemen from Nottingham Square to Bunker Hill in 12 hours, April 20, 1775, erected by the BAR in August of 2005. So there's a lot on that little monument. And again, I hadn't heard of this guy, but I thought, well, that's a pretty amazing feat. Now, there's a couple little problems with this monument. Number one, most histories say it took him 20 hours. It's 60 miles. They ended up actually going to Cambridge, where the mustering ground was. They met up with General Stark there. So it's 20 hours, but still an amazing feat. You had 60 men with weapons and gear. They had to cross the Merrimack River and obviously by a ferry. And I doubt if they had any 60-person ferries back in 1775. And then they ended up in Cambridge. The second problem with this is, yes, he got down to Cambridge on April 20, 1775, but the Battle of Bunker Hill was in June. So they conflated a few facts in this thing. When they got to Cambridge, they stayed there, and they ended up fighting at Bunker Hill, and his regiment acquitted itself quite well. So even though there's some historical inaccuracies in this little monument, it still piqued my curiosity. I wanted to find out more about Henry Dearborn, and I still think it's an amazing feat that they were able to, the day before, on April 19th, they got what was called the Concord Alarm, came to Nottingham. His militia included Epsom and Northfield and obviously Nottingham, and he had to muster all the men. They had to get to the square where they would march, and then they had to get together with another regiment, and they headed on down. Again, his Revolutionary War journals are, if you're interested, are worth looking into. You can find them online. I believe the University of Illinois has them entirely digitized, and it's fascinating reading. You can just jump in and jump out if you want to read a little bit, but it's amazing some of the things that he chronicles. He was born in North Hampton in 1751, raised in Epsom. It marks the site where he was born in North Hampton, but the home isn't there anymore. He set up a medical practice in Nottingham. He was a doctor in 1772, studied under Dr. Hal Jackson of Portsmouth. At age 24, he was made an officer of the New Hampshire Regiment, the youngest by far to be made an officer. He was committed to valor at the Battle of Monmouth. He was with Washington for the surrender of Cornwallis. He moved to Maine in 1784. He was the first U.S. Marshal for the District of Maine. He was appointed Major General of the Maine Militia. He's elected to the U.S. House of Reps in 1792. That would actually be representing Massachusetts, which Maine was part of at the time. Secretary of War under Jefferson, and I've underlined that, and I'm going to come back to that point later. Major General in the War of 1812, and he was Minister to Portugal under Madison. So he accomplished much. And again, this is for a guy I'd not heard of. This is Nottingham Square. It's a really beautiful spot. It truly is unspoiled. If you go there, it's quiet, nothing there. I think the fortunate thing, when Nottingham started to develop, all the municipal buildings and the commercial buildings set up about a mile up the road. So it left this place pretty much the same as it was. It's known as the town of four generals, and the statue commemorates them. They're Generals Bartlett, Butler, Scilly, and Dearborn. It's on this square, on this parade ground, that Dearborn trained with his militia. So, coming from Michigan, Henry Dearborn, eventually the light bulb went on. Wait a minute, is this a guy that Dearborn, Michigan is named after? You can probably guess the answer, and that is yes. So Lieutenant in 1833, Lieutenant Joshua Howard, who had served under Dearborn in the War of 1812, was tasked by the Army to establish an arsenal west of Detroit. There was a fort in Detroit, but they wanted to have an arsenal west of it. He named it Dearbornville after his commanding officer during the War of 1812. I think a lot of folks wouldn't realize that in Dearborn, at the Henry Ford Museum, the chair that Lincoln sat in when he was assassinated at Ford's Theater is there, and Rosa Parks' bus is there in the Henry Ford Museum. You would have thought that Lincoln's chair for sure would be in the Smithsonian or somewhere like that, but Henry Ford being the richest man in the world at the time, he got it. Has anybody been to this museum? Dearborn, and that's not a place, you have to be going to Dearborn or Detroit to go there. Because it's not on, you know, if you're going to Chicago from here, you don't go from Michigan. Anyway, it's a great museum to visit. And it's kind of interesting that these objects, these artifacts are in Dearborn. But more than naming the city after them, in 1803, with the purchase of Louisiana Territory, Dearborn saw the importance of establishing a communication base for the new land. He directed the commander of Fort Detroit to send 6 men to the mouth of the St. Joseph River at the south end of Lake Michigan, and that's in Chicago. That's how they spelled it then, with a view to the establishment of a pact, and that of a post. So this shows the route that they took. It's pretty much what was called the Sauk Trail, an ancient Native American trail, and US 12 pretty much follows it now. So Fort Dearborn was set up on the bottom at the base of Lake Michigan. This is the remains in 1856. There's still some of the fort left, but that's the nucleus of modern Chicago. So Dearborn really was responsible for the city of Chicago. There had been settlers there, fishermen, hunters there, but when you establish a fort somewhere, soldiers move in. They sometimes move in with their families. People move around, move in outside for safety and for trade, and the city of Chicago was born. So it's pretty significant that this guy not heard of. I'd been to Chicago. I knew there was a Dearborn street, but I still never did make any connections between Henry Dearborn and that street, nor the city of Chicago. So, just like we have Uncle Sam, and Britain has John Bull, and New York has Father Knickerbocker, but the only picture I could find of him is the New York Knicks logo. So, Henry Dearborn is a representation of the city of Chicago. This is a Chicago Tribune cartoon from actually 1910, and you can see Chicago representing, Father Dearborn is representing the city of Chicago and asking the Illinois Central to stop polluting the city. The response is not a whole lot different than I think people get from companies today. It's just sort of blowing smoke in his face, and that's the way it goes. But so he was, again, I had not known had any idea that Chicago had a representation and Father Dearborn was it. There's more than that. Everett Hale, the gentleman who wrote Man Without a Country, in a 1902 magazine wrote, observed that no wagon on 4 wheels for pleasure traveling was known until General Dearborn introduced such a wagon from the West in the period of the English War, which meant the War of 1812. And this is a replica of what's called a Dearborn wagon. He isn't claimed to have invented it, but he's claimed to have somehow brought it from the West, which would have been the Midwest at that time, to the East. It became immensely popular. It was almost like the station wagon of the day from about 1820 to 1920 until cars took over. So again, there's another part of Dearborn that is sort of something you don't know. This is a Dearborn wagon, photographer in 1868. He could take his wagon out there, he could take a shot, and he could have a darkroom in his wagon and develop his pictures. This is sort of covered by the caption at the top. This book called Down the Santa Fe Trail was written by a young woman named Susan McGoffin in 1846. The second line, it says, continues to say, a wagon with 2 yokes, 1 Dearborn with 2 mules. I don't know if you can see the word Dearborn there, but that's point is it's common usage at that time to say, we've got a Dearborn, meaning a Dearborn wagon. So he really has it's kind of a classic example of that little monument turning into a whole lot of other entity stuff. You may have a Dearborn wagon in your pantry because on this brand of Apple products, not 1 but 2 Dearborn wagons form part of the logo. So that was, to me, that little monument led to all of these things, which I had no idea of, a guy I'd never heard of to begin with. Shifting gears, no pun intended, I swear to God, I forgot this was going to be the next picture. Dover Speedway, Granite State Park I had heard when I moved to Dover that there used to be a racetrack there, and then I couldn't figure out where the heck would they have the space to have had a former racetrack, because there's no evidence of it. Interesting thing about this picture, just from another point of view, notice all these wheels in the front left are smaller than the other three. This track is so small, it's only a fifth of a mile. The drivers are pretty much always turning left, and so to have that smaller wheel here just makes it a lot better for driving. I love this picture. This is drivers that were driven at Granite State Park and other parks, Dover Speedway and other speedways in the area. This guy, this is Bob Guy. I mean, I don't know how well you can tell, but he's got perfect jeans on. He's got a nice jacket. His hair couldn't be better. This guy, does anybody know this guy? He's obviously from here. I mean, I doubt if you would. He reminds me of the kind of guy that'd be a three-letter man leaning against his locker in the senior hallway, just kind of the way he looked. That guy's named Cowboy Rivers, and you can sort of see in his face, he was known to be one of the more tougher drivers. He didn't really want to get in his way or be next to him. If you know Dover at all, his family owned a camera shop in downtown Dover called Rivers Camera. But so these are the drivers, the kind of guys that were driving. Oh, there's another Portsmouth guy too. Ray Cormier. Is that a name anybody's? I mean, this picture's taken in 1950, so it'd have to have stories would have had to come down for a long time. There's been a racetrack of some kind in that area. This is by Willen Pond. This is 108 leading to Rochester. And then up here is a way to Somersworth. So the racetrack, you can see there's a 1 mile horse racing track has been there since 1856. The car racetrack was built a little bit later. For future reference, notice here, it says Central Park. That's another chapter that I'm going to talk about later, was located in that area. Air Force shot from 1953. This shows the racetrack in 1953. The 1 mile oval is still visible. There is a 1/5 mile car racetrack, and there's like a half mile. They used it for motorcycle racing, and it looks later on they put it in motocross. Here's what it looks like now. So you can see the track going all the way up to the top, comes around. There's a Buick dealership if you know that area just beyond the north. Here's where the 1/5 mile track is, and this part has been chopped out by apartments. The first state fair was held in Dover in 1858. Before that, it sort of bounced around the state to be in different towns. And so in 1858, they had an exhibition at the Granite State Park, which is what that 1 mile horse racing oval was called. Notice this on Wednesday, the first day of the fair, little arrow there. There's one like event that's people can entertain themselves with. I'll let you read that so you get the full impact of what it was they were allowed to do that day. So, open to promiscuous driving at the discretion of the marshals, and I'm not sure what the marshals would allow. I had to look it up because I really didn't know what they meant by that. What it means is it's sort of unstructured and just don't get into trouble on it while you can take your horse and buggy around the track. But it really surprised me to see that. It made me think that maybe 1858 was more fun than we thought. In 1859, so in 1858 there was just, you could go out on the track, do the exhibitions, there was no racing. In 1859 they started racing at Granite State Trotting Park. So bad news, good news, betting on ponies, bad news, no promiscuous driving anymore. But that started a history of racing that lasted at that area until the last auto race was won in 1965. In 1896, Frank Jones bought the Granite State Trotting Park, and with the aim to make it into a world-class track, which he did. He spent an incredible amount of money building stables, barns, 30,000-gallon water tower, a hotel on it. It was really became a top-notch location. He was also a breeder of horses. He was a rangeman, which is what the jockeys on a harness outfit is called. And he was also a track runner. What I like about this picture is you notice, I've been to enough races to know Normally the ponies aren't on the rail watching the race. So I thought it was kind of interesting that the horses got to see what the competition was like. This is a couple of things I found that aren't in the book. Number one, the resolution would be good enough to print, but there's a magazine called the Granite Monthly. I don't think anybody's ever heard of that. It was a popular magazine, probably from the 1870s to early 20th century. And this is an article about the Frank Jones Brewing Company. And they call it Glass of Ale. And I looked at the article. It's like a New Yorker article. It's one of those extensive articles that gets into incredible detail about everything. But it's kind of fascinating to read. Some of the pictures were interesting. Like, here's a picture of the rail yard, which is something I had, to get that idea of the workings of the plant. This article, again, like a New Yorker article, it even talks about the history of beer brewing going back to thousands of years ago, and they even showed pictures of good yeast and bad yeast. I can't tell the difference too much, but obviously somebody could. And this is like filling the casks in the racking room. So I thought it was interesting to see some of these pictures from that contemporary magazine of the brewery. This is another good picture too of the teams waiting in the yard. So it's kind of a fascinating little sidelight that, again, I couldn't put in the book because the resolution of these pictures weren't good enough, but I thought it was worth seeing and knowing about this article in the Granite Monthly about Frank Jones. His brewery started out owned by a guy named, an Englishman named John Swindells. It was up here, and then he merged with Jones, became Swindell and Jones. Swindell was a good brewer, but he was not a good businessman. He eventually sold out to Frank Jones, and then the brewery went on that way. After Jones bought out Swindell in 1859, Swindell started up his own brewery, not successful. He set up a shoddy factory. I read that the first time, and I thought, you mean you really set up a bad factory? But I realized that shoddy was it's a cloth recycling business that I think you can still buy things that are done that way. But so he set up a shoddy factory next to the rail line from Concord. One evening, here's the only ad and the only example I could find of Swindell's his product. Obviously, you can find a lot of Frank Jones ads all over the place, but I couldn't find any John Swindell's ads, so I thought it was interesting, at least just to get one. Anyway, in 1864, the engineer on the train from Concord saw a man on one side of the track rails, and on the other side saw a little girl running toward the train. He lost sight of both of them. After the train had passed, the little girl was okay, but John Swindell just found dead on the tracks. The authorities determined that he saved the little girl's life by pushing her out of the way of the train. So obviously Swindell's, ended up accomplishing a lot by doing that thing. I haven't been able to find out the name of the little girl, or even if it's maybe in the police records from the 1860s, it could be. But if she survived and had children, then obviously there's a lot of folks around here who would be thankful for John Swindell for that act. Under Jones, Granite State Park became one of the premier harness racing tracks in the U.S. It became part of what's known as the Grand Circuit. It's the oldest continuous horse racing series in North America. During Granite State Park's heyday, the Grand Circuit visited Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, Grand Rapids, Hartford, Poughkeepsie, Syracuse, Lexington, Atlanta, other towns, and as well as Dover. This was the only New England stop on the Grand Circuit, so it put Dover, New Hampshire on the map. This is a Boston Globe article from 1912. It's hard to read the top, but it says after Jones passed away in 1902, the track was bought by Walter Cox of Epsom. And so the headline up there talks about Cox taking 2 carloads of fast horses to Grand Rapids. It was big news when Granite State horses were going out and running on the Grand Circuit. This is a picture of the track in 1940. You can barely see the half-mile inside on the inner left of it. This is the back straight today. So this shows how much of this racetrack is still left. The back straight is really quite clear. So this is that. And it's pretty amazing that that's still there. Most racetracks, think of Rockingham, once they close, it's easy to develop land and they turn into retail and housing facilities like Rockingham has. This place still largely exists, the tracks, some of the fixtures. This picture from about 1950, there guys on the front straight, and you look up to the left, you can see the white line of the retaining wall at the edge of the track. And part of that retaining wall there still exists. So it's pretty amazing that that's around. It's wood. It was built in the 40s, so it's now, what, 80 years old. It hasn't been stripped out, and it's amazing that it's still there. But eventually, it's going to be sold because it's up for sale. It's owned mostly by the city of Somersworth, and it's up for sale. Here's another view. There's a little bit of the asphalt left of the track and that, but again, it'll be gone eventually. The only other claim to fame of this area, and if you've been reading, if you read Foster's, there was a large homeless encampment in that area that they had to move out. And the first time I went over there, naively, to go by myself to look around, I thought, what are all these blue tarps doing out in the middle of the woods? You know, because I didn't see anybody around. Well, I found out later, blue tarps belonged to the homeless. But it's still fascinating that that still exists, and eventually it's going to be gone. It's in my book. It's the only thing that I have in my book, the only subject in the book that is not going to be permanent, at least for the foreseeable future. Everything else that I show will be things that will be there a long time. Little Boar's Head, just down the road in North Hampton. My wife, when we moved here, we obviously loved driving up and down Ocean Boulevard. We drive by all the little huts. We drove by this a bunch of times, and I just assumed they were, you know, cottages or something along those lines, but they're not. They're a lot more. They were. They're fish houses. They first referenced in 1804 when a Northampton town ordinance dictated the building of a road from the town center to the fish houses. It was originally named Little Boar's Head. I don't know why it was named that. It was by a British sailor in the 1690s, and why it changed to the spelling. But so that's what that little neighborhood is called there. Here's a view of them from the other side, obviously. That's the first one. All the rest are one story. That one's two. My wife and I finally decided to park right next to it. And we pulled in one day and we checked it out, and there's this sign, Kings Highway and Public Highway, Little Boar's Head District. There's another sign there that explains what these are. But this Kings Highway is interesting because you can see there's not much to it. But that's it, where that woman is walking, for example. But by 1644, there was a road existed along the seashore from Portsmouth to Hampton. And so this was that. Kings Highway just meant the road was owned by the Crown rather than a private road like a turnpike would be. In 1653, the Massachusetts Crown Commissioners ordered the building of a road from Kittery to Portland, completing a length along the coast of Boston. And then in 1664, King Charles II ordered a road built from Boston all the way to Charleston, South Carolina. All of this is the forerunner of the current US 1. Now, obviously, over the years, it got moved inland, but US 1 basically follows the old Kings Road from Kittery to, actually goes past Kittery. It goes up, and at least as far as Goose Rocks Beach, because there's still a road in Goose Rocks Beach. That's called the Kings Road. There's also one in Hampton. There's a Kings Road just parallel to the main road that goes by the beach there. Here's a picture of all of them except for one. The North Hampton fish houses 1 through 4, and there's 6 through 12. Where that V is, there's one that is too far back to be seen in the photograph. So there's 12 of them. They were assigned numbers in an application for the National Register of Historic Places. Fish House 4 was the last one for fishing, used for fishing, was the last used for fishing until 1956. This is what it did look like inside of a fish house. They were used by either people whose job was only fishing and they kept their gear there, or a lot of the farmers in that area would farm in the summertime and fish in the wintertime, so they would also keep their gear there. But this one's actually in Hampton. There's 2 in Hampton, if you know, they're right by the beach, if you know where those are. One of them is original and authentic. The other one was a facsimile rebuild. And like I said, there's 12 in Hampton. But what I also like about this picture, to look carefully, there's a guy in the back just kind of leaning on, you know, on his shoulder, checking out the scene inside the fish house. But so that's a good example of what would have been going on inside of a fish house. Fish house number 6, which is this one, was pushed onto Ocean Boulevard during the Great Nor'easter of 1978, but it suffered no damage. They're built very strong. They're built almost like boats. And so I think I read that not even any glass was broken in that house when I got pushed onto the highway. Fish houses 9 and 10, those two on the right, were the first to be used for other than fishing by, and that says sculptor Melvina Hoffman, who converted them into a studio in the 1940s. I'd not heard of Melvina Hoffman until I did research for this, but living in Detroit, I went to the DIA a lot, and I remember seeing the sculpture and thinking, well, that's a really pretty sculpture, but then going on to look at something else. And I didn't realize this is one of her sculptures of Anna Pavlova, the dancer who was a friend of hers, that she'd done in 1915. Her father was an Englishman who was hired by P.T. Barnum to be the piano accompanist for Jenny the Swedish Nightingale Lynn. So she came from a artistic family. They lived in New York. And it's kind of a little interesting side note that, again, her father was employed by P.T. Barnum. There's sculptures of hers all over the world. There's one in France at an American cemetery, a really beautiful one. They're all over the world. The nearest one to here that I could find was at the Harvard Memorial Church in Harvard Square. And this is, it's called The Sacrifice. It was made to honor the Harvard men who lost their lives in the Great War. She studied under Auguste Rodin, the guy who made the finger, and Gutzon Borglum, the guy who built Mount Rushmore. So she obviously studied under some really master sculptors. Little Boar's Head was kind of a summer colony for the well-to-do. Studebakers had homes on either end, and you've probably seen both of these, because this one's actually, I think, it's not in North Hampton. This is on the north end, and that one's on the south end. I like this picture of the Studebaker ad, because it's the Studebakers. But what I like about it is from 1929, is even though the setting is obviously California, it looks like to me, but the fashions I think that you see these people in 1929, to me would be the kind of fashions that people would have been wearing at the Little Boar's Head colony during that time. So I thought it was kind of fitting to have that example. President Garfield, Arthur Taft, Roosevelt, Robert Todd Lincoln were amongst many, many people who visited Little Boar's Head at the time. Franklin Pierce eventually built a house there. One woman named Alice Hobson, who lived there, every summer would have concerts on the lawn, pretty much a precursor to Tanglewood, where they'd be out on the lawn under the stars. In July 30th of 1929, a special benefit concert was held there for the Squalus. It was Arthur Fiedler directed the DSO and a fundraiser. The Squalus, I'll tell you the story in a minute, but what I want to notice the bow on the Squalus. It's like a bow on any ship that would have been built at that time. But the Squalus in May of 39 went out on sea trials. It was about 12 miles out by the Isles of Shoals. Captain gave the order to dive, and then the engine room started take her up. There was a hatch open. A 3-foot hatch was open for some reason, and the ship sank to the bottom, 200 and some feet down. Up until that time, no submarine rescue had taken place for a ship that was in more than 20 feet of water. So this is 200 feet, and obviously they didn't have a lot of time. 25 sailors sadly died right away, either drowned or were swept away, but 33 survived in 3 of the 7 chambers that we still had air, and were air pockets. So a huge, obviously, thing was set up to rescue the men in the ship. They weren't sure what to do. They contacted Charles Sweet Monson and Alan McCann. They were naval designers. They were working on a diving bell down in Connecticut. And they figured the only way they could get the men out would be to use that diving bell, but the diving bell had never been tested for such a thing. In the meantime, this is one of the first times that this went out on national radio. WBZ set up a station there. They were broadcasting to the nation the rescue efforts, what was going to happen. Lavina Hoffman, because of her knowledge of metallurgy, was brought in as a consultant because she just knew about how metals work. One thing I learned as I read about this was the cleverness that you have to come up with faced with adversity. There was a phone line that in the Squalus that's attached to a buoy that they sent up. And so theoretically, you could talk to somebody on the surface. Unfortunately, after a minute, the line broke. So they lost communication. But what they did is one of the ships in the rescue squadron dragged an anchor chain across the Squalus, and they were able to bang out Morse code on the hull with hammers, and they could communicate that way while the rescue was going on. So to me, the inventiveness is amazing that they can do that sort of thing. They did end up rescuing everybody that was left in that concert held by Mrs. Hobson at Little Boar's Head was to a benefit for the families or the surviving sailors. The Albacore was designed by Monson. It was a revolutionary ship, and this is around 1950. And what's different about it, what makes it revolutionary, is notice the bow on this is snub nose, almost bullet shaped. So think of the Squalus had a bow like any old sailing ship at the time, not very effective under the water. He realized you could get a lot more speed out of that type of design of the ship. And so that's still pretty much the theory behind submarine building today. I had to get my grandsons in, so they're there posing in front of the Albacore a couple of years ago. The cover story, sort of, New Hampshire Central Park. This is absolutely my favorite picture. This is why it's on the cover. There was a park. Has anybody ever heard of the Central Park up there? I mean, there's nothing left of it now. I showed you on that early map that had the race course. On the other side of Willen Pond, there's an area that said Central Park. So it was also in the area of Dover, Rochester, Somersworth. But there was a pretty large amusement park there that lasted for quite a while. This picture's from about 1910, and it's obviously, you know, it's a pretty happy picture of the women out having a good time at the park. It was originally called Burgett Park. The gentleman, last name of Burgett, bought a horse railroad, a trolley system, and he decided to build a park along the way. They were called trolley parks. They were common. Trolley park is a park that streetcar companies would build because their main business was taking workers to and from work Monday through Friday. They wanted to drum up business on the weekends, so they built these amusement parks, and you could take their trolley out there. So Henry Burgett had this park built. You can see there's a ball field that's still an empty space. I don't know if you know that area. There's a Central Park garage on this side. That's still there for sale, and everything else has been built upon. But you can see there is, I think this is a running track. There's a carousel. There's that structure which looks like some kind of ride, tennis courts, trolley barns right here, because you can see the trolley. And 1 year after he opened the park, he changed the name to Central Park. Obviously, Burgett Park's not real inspiring, and it's to provide the notion that it's between Dover, Somersworth, and Rochester. Somersworth used to be Great Falls. There was 4 trolley parks in New Hampshire at one time. Besides Central Park, there was Pine Island in Manchester, Kentucky River in Concord, and Canopy Lake, which obviously still exists. It's one of the few trolley parks in the country that still do exist. Here's another trolley park that you may have seen. This is Coney Island. It's also a trolley park. You take the train to get there. At one time, there's over 1,000 in the US. Now there are around a dozen. Kennedy Lake being one of them. If you watch Seinfeld, there's a really good Seinfeld episode where Seinfeld takes the subway all the way to Coney Island, and he's with a very interesting passenger. But I also am amazed by these two women in this. They did never get me up in that. I mean, that's just like a couple of cables and you know, a couple of cotton chairs, it looks like. Mary Dowd owned the horse railroad that Henry Burgess bought. He bought it in 1888 and then built a park. She was the first woman in the world to own a railroad. And that made her world famous, especially in railroading circles. It just wasn't done. She was a minority holder in the horse railroad. In 1889, she gained a majority of the stock, appointed president, and she's the world's first. The stock rose from $7 to $100 a share, so they obviously knew what she was doing. She was presented at Congress, met with President Cleveland. She's also a professional stage actress before she got married, performing at the U.S. Grant's Daughter, was an assistant principal at Rochester's high school. In 1887, she successfully demanded the right to vote in Dover 33 years before the 19th Amendment. She may have been the first woman to vote in New Hampshire, because I looked it up. And, you know, first woman to vote in New Hampshire. The only name they gave was somebody voted in 1920, a woman. And that would be logical because that's after women's suffrage, there would be a bunch of women voting and somebody had to be the first one to sign up somewhere. But she, given this was 33 years before the 19th Amendment, very well could have been the first woman to vote in New Hampshire. This is just a picture of a horse railroad that used to exist in Lawrence, just to give you an idea of what they look like. What's interesting is that here she's featured on the cover of a trade magazine, Street Railway Gazette, and then she's an article about her in this ladies magazine. But what is amazing about it, Mary E.H. Dowd, ex-president of the Dover Horse Railroad, is a woman of medium height. Her eyes are dark blue gray, the nose is straight, her brows are arched. She wears her light brown hair in the style known as the pompadour and dresses in rich garments. So even then, you know, as a woman, they have to talk about how she looks and how she dresses and everything. I thought it was pretty amazing for someone who was famous for being the first woman owner of a railroad in the world. The park, this picture here shows this is a bear cage. For some reason, there's a bear cage there. Above that, you can see there's a little arrow pointing to another little stone structure, and then there's what they call the casino, which is really an entertainment place and restaurant. Foundations for the casino, porch is still there. Boy Scout Eagle Project was to restore the bear cage, and he did an excellent job on it. He also restored the garden, that little thing up the top. This is what it looked like before. This is what it looked like after David Brackett completed his Eagle Project. He beautifully renovated it. He's now at the Air Force Academy. He did this when he was 13, so I guess it's not surprising that he's doing pretty well. But he did a wonderful job on that. And the trolley barns that I pointed out earlier, this is a later one, made of brick. Has anybody been to this liquor store? It's a really wonderful example of reuse and honoring an old structure. They were going to put in a drop ceiling in it, covering up a whole bunch of interesting like works in the top, and they left that open. They spent a lot of dough on it. And you can also buy a $3,000 bottle of cognac there if you're looking for a Christmas present for somebody. Atkinson Academy. Anybody been by that? Yeah, Atkinson, it's not on the way to anywhere. I mean, it's just, Atkinson Academy is on a small road that goes from one fairly major road to another. Anyway, I believe it's the oldest continuous use school in the United States. That's not a college. They don't really claim it because it'd have to be researched. But what is interesting about it is it was incorporated in 1787. This building was built in 1883, but the other 1803. It's the second co-ed school in the United States, which I think is pretty significant that happened here. The oldest co-ed school in the United States is Leicester Academy. Now it's Leicester High School in Massachusetts. First college wasn't co-ed until Oberlin in Ohio in 1837. So it's pretty significant that Atkinson had was the second school to be co-educated. There's a lot of old school buildings that are older than the Atkinson Academy. This was his classroom at Durham Academy in 1791, but there hasn't been a classroom for a long time. Now it's offices. So Exeter has buildings on campus that are older than Atkinson's building, but they're also offices, or one of them is a club. Atkinson's, I believe, is the only one that's still being used for its original purpose, which is educating students. Here's a picture in around 1900, and it's just, you can see it hasn't changed much at all. Pictures here, I don't think you can see them. Can anybody see, right above your finger, there's a stick, and things out with a couple of balls, something hanging out, it's too hard to see back there. It's a weird game, obviously. I wonder what these kids are out there, maybe it's a field day. I've been trying to figure out what this game was. It's a stick with a bar going across and hanging from string, or two small balls. I have no idea what kind of game that could be. It clearly looks like a game. I have no idea. Reverend Stephen Peabody co-founded the Academy along with Nathaniel Peabody and Cogswell. His wife Elizabeth was married to John Quincy Adams. You can sort of tell the difference in status. It's a nice picture of Reverend Peabody. This one is by Singer, this painting. So she obviously had the clout to get a really nice painting done. Or Sargent, I mean. Her daughter, Polly Peabody, this is her as an adult, was one of the 3 girls who entered the academy in 1791, thereby creating the second co-ed school in the United States. Just a few years after Leicester Academy had theirs. This is from an 1894 New England Register. The tradition is that Polly Peabody told her father she was going to the academy. He was amazed at such a thing. For up until that time, 2 girls had received more than an elementary education, but she and some of her companions were admitted, sat with the boys, and coeducation was established. This is the quote from this magazine. The advocates of women's rights should give merited credit to Polly Peabody and the Atkinson Academy for this advance in the movement in the higher education of women. It just wasn't done. A former Maine governor was a student there, and I love this quote: "If I were to be a boy again and go to Atkinson Academy, I should hope to meet the pure, young, intelligent, and pure girls whose presence in society did so much to mend the manners and improve the hearts of the somewhat rough specimens of incipient manhood on the opposite benches." So he obviously got a good sense of humor, but he enjoyed having the girls there and thought it bettered him. A couple other interesting things. In Atkinson, they have a historical museum. This phrenology head was used at Atkinson Academy. Franz Joseph Gall was the guy who came up with the idea of phrenology, which was that lumps and things on your head dictated your personality. He came up with that theory when he was in like 12 or so, when he noticed that kids with large foreheads seemed to have a better memory. So he theorized that how your head looked dictated all your traits. Obviously that's discredited, but one thing that's interesting, he was one of the first people to realize or postulate that emotions didn't come from the heart, but they came from your brain. So he obviously, even though he came up with kind of a not very scientific idea, he did come up with a pretty good revelation. Another Atkinson alumni, Dr. Ralph Sawyer. This is him at Bikini Atoll in 1946. I love the FDR type cigarette case, and he's sitting pretty jaunty in his uniform for the tropics. He graduated from Atkinson in 1911, Dartmouth in 1915, Chicago with a PhD in physics in 1919. He served 45 years at the University of Michigan, rising to a dean. So he was a pretty illustrious graduate of Atkinson as well. Plus, I love the picture. One of the things about Atkinson, which I didn't know, but I know of this as a former teacher. My wife's an elementary school teacher, so she knows it more. In the early 80s, UNH Professor Dowd Graves had a study about teaching and writing, when I was a kid, I remember it well, and I handed in a writing assignment, especially in first and second grade, and my grammar was not very good, so I'd usually often get a D or an E because my grammar was lousy. Well, this study pretty much showed that when you're giving a writing assignment, you should be just having the kids put down their ideas on paper, not grade them on their grammar or their spelling and all that kind of stuff. That's a huge thing, which now pretty much everybody recognizes that. But it's interesting that UNH and Atkinson were really a place where this sea change in teaching writing really took place. And so I thought that was a fascinating thing, again, especially as a former teacher. I know now, to ask any teacher to just get your ideas down on paper, we'll worry about the grammar later. I would have loved it, because I probably would have done better. Town pounds, it says strays, reavers, reeves, and pounders up there. I gotta get my nose, take a break while I blow my nose. Okay, I'm back. This is the town pound in Durham, established in 1708. It's New Hampshire's oldest town pound. This is not the original structure. The original structure was wood, but this one's built in 1808, I believe. Again, coming from Michigan, I'd never heard of a town pound. I kept asking people, what are these structures with walls by the side of the road all over the place? And finally, the guy said, well, I think they're town pounds. So I decided to look into, well, what the heck are they? There's not a lot here down by the seacoast, because I think down here, fishing and things like that were more the businesses. You only need a town pound where there's a lot of cattle. Part of the title about strays, reeves, and pounders. I don't know if anybody remembers this a few years ago, but I saw this online. A bunch of pigs got loose in Vermont, and they run wild, and they destroy stuff, and they finally had to hire somebody to pick up. But this is a perfect example of why towns have what was called a hog reeve, which is a paid position. Your job was when the hogs got out, somebody's hogs, you went and fetched them up and brought them back and kept them until the owner could come and get them. I guess they're especially destructive. But I did, when I saw that, I thought, well, that's pretty much encapsulated perfectly. As far as I know, they got them back. Town pounds originated in England, often sometimes called pinfolds. This one's in about a little town in northern England near Newcastle, about 1890. What I like about it, it's located next to the Wheatchief Inn. In other words, it's located next to a pub. And so the drovers could take a break, go into the pub, and they somehow still managed to find a way to keep driving the cattle later on. What I also like is these people posing in the pound with their animals. It's something you really don't see very often, that folks just let's pose with the animals in the pub. I love the look on the police officer's face, looking down like, what the heck is going on in there? It's a great picture. Unfortunately, the resolution of this wasn't good enough for me to use in the book, but I like the picture. Construction of a pound was one of the first civic acts in any new colonial town, for impounding strays or collecting overdue taxes. So it's more than just impounding strays. If you weren't paying your taxes, your animals might be confiscated and put in the pound, and you'd have to pay to get them out. This one's in Sandown from 1793. This is one of the things. For a while, I worked over for the Timberlane School District, and so I wandered the back roads back through Sandown and drove by that one. That's pretty interesting. So, the town of Manchester, I have a picture later, is called Dairyfield. It was originally part of Derry, and when they moved up that way to form what became Manchester, Dairyfield in Manchester, one of the first things they did was build a pound, because you have to find a way to control the animals and to make sure they weren't destroying things or making sure they weren't getting lost. This is a newspaper article from Hobart, Tasmanian Mercury in 1884. I'm a regular reader for Hobart Mercury. I was lucky enough to find that. I'm not really. But anyway, so this is in Australia. This is a good example of how it works. This is notice at the top it says impoundments. The public pound in Swansea, impounded at the above pound, one red and white heifer, white face, red spot below the forehead with horns, age about 3 years, no brands. Damages claimed 10 shillings. It's about a half a pound back then, which would be a lot of money now. So you had to pay to get your animals, the heifer out, you have to pay the damage that the heifer did to the property that he was taken from. And then there's also poundage fee, food and water for 1 shilling 6 pence a day. So that's, I don't know, it's probably a couple of bucks anyway, probably more than that. So you didn't not only had to pay damages, you had to pay the pound keeper for the keep of the animal. And then if the animal's not claimed within the time allowed by law, to be sold at public auction. The other interesting thing about this article, I looked into a little more about this pound keeper. David Haynes, at age 19, was convicted in England for stealing some cloth, so he's sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia. He was let off in 6 years, but he stayed there, obviously. And so even though he's a convicted criminal, he rose to positions of responsibility. He became the pound keeper, and he became also the jail keeper in town. So I like this because it's an example of how the pound system worked, but it also kind of gives a little insight into how the system worked in the settlement of Australia. This is in Dairyfield Pound. This looks like something out of the Twilight Zone. And the first time I drove by it, I worked at Southside Middle School. I drove to the north side, to Hillside for a meeting, and I looked over Dairyfield Park, and there was this. And it's like something you think, well, what the heck could that possibly be? It is the remains of the Dairyfield Town Pound, which was built in 1841. This is what it looked like around 1900. You can see there's the opening, there's the pillars on the side, but there's no top on it. This is what it looked like in 1976. You can see the stones have started to somehow disappear, and there's been a lintel put on top. The lintel was put on top by the DAR in 1916. It says Town Pound, 1841, and Dollar Star chapter was DAR. Here is the Town Pound gate here. My contention is the only reason this Town Pound gate is still there is when they tore down the pound to get rid of it all. They dare not take down something that the DAR had put a commemorative stone on. So they left that up, and hence you have just the pound gate and the lintel on top. It's the only pound that I can find in New Hampshire that still has a function, even though it had nothing to do with animals. Usually a bunch of middle school kids about to do a cross-country race at Dairyfield Park, and the race instructions say, when you get to the Town Pound gate, take a left and head toward the finish line. So it actually has a function in life as opposed to all other town pounds, which are just sitting there. How long do you want me to go here? You guys good? Another one? We'll do this. This is an interesting one as well. My first job, as Katie mentioned, was as a special ed consultant for the DOE. So I went to a bunch of school districts to consult on special ed matters. One of the school districts was Windham, which did not have a high school at the time. I was meeting with administrators there, and I'd seen this article in the Globe in March of 2006, the 1799 bridge divides New Hampshire town and past versus present, landmark snarl school project. This is a school project at the landmark snarled. A friend of mine who was an administrator who wasn't happy about they had to hold up the project said, I can't believe they're going to hold up the whole project for a pile of rocks, which is pretty much what it looks like, but it is a significant pile of rocks. This is a picture of what's called the London Bridge Causeway, built in 1799. This is in 2005. The controversy begins when the Windham School District wanted to build a high school access road, which would go, they planned to go right through where that was, therefore that would have to be demolished. The Windham Historic District Commission cited the Federal Highway Administration Act that said any highway building, you have to take into account historic structures along the way. So this halted the project. The school district wasn't happy, hence my friend being mad about the pile of rocks holding up the high school. Did delay it by at least 6 months, I think. But it is a significant structure. Causeways are different than bridges, in that bridges support the roadway on pillars and there's a lot of room underneath for water and stuff. Causeways are just built with stones, often on ground where it's a leak, where there's a spring there or a tiny stream, and the water can just seep through the stones without destroying it. The National Register of Historic Places got into the act. There's only 4 of these left in the state. It's a rare intact example of early road building in Windham, well-preserved example of late 18th or early 19th century and related road construction. Relatively uncommon in that most causeways are construction of logs, rock, and earth. So, not surprisingly, the district lost. Historic District 1, School District 0. Dr. James Garvin, state architectural historian, said the causeway is eligible for its significance in history, engineering, and its potential to yield important information about the construction of these types of structures. So here's another picture of it. I took this one probably in about, I don't know, 2010 or 11. It was still pretty visible then. Another Boy Scout Eagle project, Nick Rotizio, his family owns a really big food and restaurant distribution company in Windham. His Eagle project was to kind of restore and honor the causeway. He graduated, I think it's the London area where Windham kids went then, so he didn't graduate from Windham High because it wasn't built yet. But he got into, he got interested in the story, and once this was saved, he told me that when the high school was being built, this area was just, this wasn't here. This area was just surrounded by just a cheap fence, and there's trash and junk in it. And he made a Eagle project to clean it up and to build this nice, with a seating area. It's hard to read, but on this bench, it commemorates the causeway, and it's made into a nice little place. It's something that you would think that a school district would use as a good historical learning experience for the town. But this is what it looks like now. Here it is. So I think that the school district was ticked off that they lost. And so instead of keeping a really nice structure up with the benches where, when I was working in high school, I was working with student government, and I knew that student government kids or NHS kids or any kid would love to go out and spend a half a day if they could. Hey, let's go clean up this thing over here. But now that this is sort of, the high school sort of let it run into ruin. If you drive by, you really can't hardly see it. It's off of London Bridge Road, which runs off of 111. And then if you go left toward the high school, it's there on the left. But you really can't see it, which is a shame, but at least it's preserved. Ironically, Windham Center School, one of the elementaries, commemorated it. The high school has done nothing about it. Anybody here from Windham? I'm not, okay, good. They want to get controversial. This elementary school has a 5th grade, I think that's their graduating year from the elementary school project, where the kids build a mosaic for something about town. Well, they decided to commemorate the London Bridge, which is what that's called. Now, there's a few problems. Pretty sure there's no mountains in Windham. And this is obviously a bridge with a river running underneath it, and we know that it's not that. But having said that, at least they took the time to commemorate a historic site in the state. And so I thought that was pretty significant, especially given that the high school was just sort of letting it go to seed. Still, I mean, it's more, one more. Okay, this one, it's probably the last one. The meeting house at Dover Point. Remember, right by Tuttle's. Anybody used to go to Tuttle's? I think just beyond it, you drive by this site by the side of the road. This is heading south on Dover Point Road. On the right, there's this open area, and the sign, historic site, First Parish Church in Dover, erected here 1654. I drove by it a ton of times, not thinking anything about it. It was just a big open field that I was surprised hadn't been developed. But if you look carefully, you can see there's the earthworks here. See the earthworks there? There's a dip in it, and it goes back that way. And it turns out that's pretty significant. It's one of the oldest structures in the state. Oh, town records. So I read a lot of the town records. This is one of my favorite. George Webb is presented by the court for living idle like a swine. I had no idea how they came up with that terminology for a sentence, but George Webb obviously was not living well. So from the photograph you saw before, this is what was there. As far as I found, this is the only example in the United States or Canada of a church, a meeting house that had a fort around, palisades, fort, stockades. And that's what those earthworks were. So this picture's, I think, from about 1880. It's not identified, it's just identified with the letter R. But I think it's from 1880. So Dover Point Road that we saw would be going here, heading south. Here's the mound. So I point here, the part that goes by the road, and then it turns up that way, and the dip was there. Here and up there were what they called sconces, were basically just sentry towers situated such that all four walls could be viewed while meeting was in progress. That's just the language that authorized the building of the palisades. Spelling credits agreed that Captain Coffin to build the fort around the meeting house in 1654. Oh, the interesting thing about this actually is the date that the selectmen passed it was the 4th day of the 5th month of 1667. And that's the old school calendar. That is the same as July 4th. But July 4th is July is the 7th month. In the old calendar, New Year's used to be in March for a lot of folks anyway. So if you consider March as the first month, well, March, April, May, June, July. July is the 5th month of the year. So it got to be pretty confusing, especially when you read historical documents about the dates, because we're so used to thinking the 5th month would be May, but back then it was July. That wasn't rectified till, I think, the 1750s. Couple other things from the town notices. This is an interesting one. October 15, 1659. Quakers were not really well received there because they would not tip their hat to the betters and stuff like that. With a due regard to the proprieties of the life and authorities convicted James Newton and wife and son for entertaining Quakers 4 hours one day, fined 40 shillings an hour according to the law. So 40 shillings an hour is 100 for 4 hours, 160 shillings. That's £8, but that's about $1,500 today. So they were fined $1,500 for having some Quakers visit for a few hours. So that's sort of the way things work. There's a more famous story, which I get into the book. It's John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a poem called "How the Women," I think, were driven from Dover. Is anybody familiar with that? The Blue Bridge leading into Massachusetts over the Merrimack, the John Greenleaf Whittier Bridge. He was a Quaker. Suffice to say that 3 women were shunted, made to leave town in a very cruel and misogynistic way. And so that's the other side of the story. This is the Dover Friends Meeting House and Quaker Building. It's the oldest church in Dover. Here's another one. I mean, Portsmouth residents ought to be proud of. The multiplicity of public houses occasioning many disorders is simply enacted that there be but 6 taverns in Portsmouth, 3 in Hampton, 2 in Dover, 1 at Oyster River, 2 Exeter, 2 in Newcastle. So you Portsmouth folks got 6 pubs, and the rest of us had to do with 1 or 2. I don't know how long that lasted. This is an aerial shot from 1940, just to give you the perspective of the thing. Here's Newington, Pomeroy Cove, where first settlers landed. The first meeting house is gone. The second meeting house where the fortified fort was there. Oh, ironically, even though there was a lot of trouble between the settlers and the Native Americans all over this area, they never had any there. So even though they built a fortified meeting house, they never had to defend it in any way. They just got along well with the Native Americans there. There was a lot of, in the first 8 years of Dover settlement, they went through 5 preachers in 9 years. It was a small settlement of a couple hundred people. You wonder how you could be fighting about the preaching, but they did. So this really happened. Thomas Larkin one day knocked the hat off of this guy's head. Later on, they had a confrontation. Hanson Nolis carried a gun to the confrontation with Thomas Larkin. Also at this confrontation, another person in his party took a halberd, which is a like a long sword with an axe on it. It's the thing that the Swiss guards carry, and he attached a Bible to it. So if that's not a bit incongruous, they put a Bible on a major weapon, I don't know what it is. So they actually had this armed confrontation. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, and they were all told to stop, and they did. Somebody was fined 100 pounds, which, as we know now, that's a ton of dough back then. Hendrik Nollis is the guy who actually ended up founding the first parish church, though, in Dover. These guys both went to Cambridge University, so obviously the university ties didn't help. This is just an archaeological rendering of the National Register of Historic Places the church had done. So this is parallel to Dover Point Road. In the back, it's back here. Dover Point Road, there's this. So you can see that the depression there is the other sconce, where the other guard post would be. And then here you can see, this is what I showed you in the first photograph. One more picture of this. So this is what I showed you before, more or less. So that's there. And then this picture is from right above where the exit, right next to that, way up there, embankment on the side. This wall here was put in, again, another example, by the DIR in 1902. And I think that was significant because not long after that, obviously cars would have been a lot more prevalent. And it's very possible that this whole area could have deteriorated quite a bit had it not been protected by this. Because it's really pretty much unchanged now. The church that was there, the meeting house, was finally taken down around 1720, but the earthworks have stayed pretty much intact for all that time, and earthworks usually just don't last. There was an archaeological dig done there in 2018 and 19 by UNH, and they did find a bit of the clay floor. And I think in this picture, they've already covered it back over to preserve it. But it's the first evidence at all of the meeting house building itself that had been found. So that's pretty significant. I'm sure they're planning on doing more. But I think that's pretty big right now that they've started to do the archaeology on it. Last one. This is Broad Hill, the city of Seth. Durham residents, this one's for you. Driving down 108, I would pass these four buildings a lot. There's actually a fifth one. In fact, they're similar, not identical. They have the same footprint. And so I thought, well, what the heck are these things? They're Shipwright's homes built in 1800 on what's called Broad Hill section, the small section of Durham. The town pound is just right here, about another 100 yards past, if the most. If 108's going this way, the town pound is right up there that I showed you earlier. Broad Hill comes from the name Colgrove family. Here's an old map that shows, here's the town pound here, here's these homes here, here's what's now 108. Here's the bridge that goes over the river, there's the dam that they're taking down, this is 108. Road to Dover, go to Durham, and then there. James Coe was a shipbuilder, amongst many other things, and these are homes he had built for his shipwrights. Here's another picture of the four homes. This one is an older cobbler's cottage from 1761, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, those other ones, and those are all shipwrights homes built by Joseph Coe for his sailors, or for his shipwrights. In an old book called Landmarks of Ancient Dover by Mary Thompson, there's a poem, Broad Hill, the city of Seth, were not for Joe Coe, they would all starve to death. I have no idea what that means, but it sounds significant. I'm guessing that on Broad Hill, Joseph Coe took care of his shipwrights and built them nice homes, otherwise they would starve to death. But he was a pretty interesting guy. He's a shipbuilder, he's an entrepreneur, he's a political activist. He wrote a book that's still in publication. I don't think I've references in this, but it has to do with pretty much all the presidents leading up to 1841 when he wrote the book. There's a picture I had up earlier. This is oyster land in 1825. This is the side of the shipbuilding industry. I think I read that over 70 ships were built in Durham's harbor during the shipbuilding days. That bridge is the bridge on 108. You can see just beyond the bridge, it's hard to see in the back, there's a dam that's there, but not for much longer. Going down that way, toward Exeter and Newmarket and Newfields, is where the town pound is and also where those homes. And I think Three Chimneys, I call it Four Chimneys. The Three Chimneys restaurant is there. This is a park here now, roughly where those horses are. But that's a good view of Durham in 1825. This is his book. So Joseph Cole called The True Americans, containing inaugural addresses and other documents of all the presidents from 1789 to 1830. It's still in print. You can still buy this book. So he's obviously, it's significant that this gentleman still has his work still being read and published. And one of these is from England, one's from the US. Side note that I found out about, Henry Wilson, New Hampshire's only vice president. He was born Jeremiah Jones Colbath. The reason this story makes the book, Colbath is of the same family, different spelling of the Colbroths, the people that Broth Hill is named after. Here's a campaign poster from 1872 with US grant. Henry Wilson hated his name. He hated his dad. His dad named him Jeremiah Jones after some rich neighbor to basically kiss up to the guy, hoping that somehow he would give the family a bunch of money. Well, he didn't. I guess his dad didn't really do a whole lot of anything. So Henry Wilson, I think at around age 17 or 18, left, walked down to Natick. He tried to get jobs in New Hampshire, didn't he? Walked to Natick, started a shoe business, he became a very successful shoemaker. Again, he's New Hampshire's only vice president. Interestingly enough, both Cole, a Democrat, and Wilson, Republican, are both anti-slavery, but I think that's probably a northern thing anyway, northeast thing anyway. But I found it very interesting about this connection about Henry Wilson and his old name. This is the Joseph Cole building from around 1825. This way is the road to Dover. You turn here, and that's the road down toward Exeter and Newfields and Newmarket and all those towns. So this is right at the corner. It was a powerful statement in that it was a building built of brick. Most buildings were built of wood back then. It's also at a brilliant location because the harbor was not far behind where he's got his ships. He's got a store that can bring the stuff off the ships and serve Dover area, Exeter, Newfields area, Durham right back this way. The building on the top is now the Durham Historical Society, and on the bottom it's still used for the city of Durham as Parks and Rec. So his imprint, Joseph Coe's imprint, is still very much around in Durham. That's really the end.